Well, last weekend, last Friday, I went to bed. All seemed to be well in Russia, and then woke up on Saturday morning and all hell seemed to have broken loose. Now, the 1 hour, the 1 day, I suppose, sort of revolution, sort of coup, but not really, happened, and the Wagner group was involved. But have things settled down now, or are there further threats for Vladimir Putin? And what effect, if any, is it having on the war in Ukraine? Of course, the Wagner group, with anything between 12,000 and 20,000 troops, have now been apparently brought in to the Russian army. Let's get an assessment of where things are now, how stable things are, from Mary Dejevsky, who is the foreign affairs columnist at The Independent. She's a former Russia correspondent for many outlets, including The Times. Mary, it's a pleasure to have you on the programme again. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and thank you for having me again.
Things seem to have calmed down a little bit, Mary, have they? Or are the worries for Putin still swirling around? What's your assessment of where things are today, the 1st of July, rather than where they were a week ago, or how things have developed?
Well, it is extraordinary, isn't it, when you think back how fast-moving everything was this time last week, and how relatively it's sort of almost all gone away. But I think that's been partly a result of a very definite and very determined effort on the part of President Putin and the Kremlin, basically to spin the whole story of what happened last Saturday in a way that flatters them. So you've got Putin and the Kremlin on the one hand saying everything's fine, everything's smoothed over, Putin was the great hero of the hour. And then you've got two other people who were involved. You've got the chief mutineer, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is supposed to be in exile in Belarus. And you've got the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, who was said to be the chief architect of the deal that settled all this, at least for the time being. So those are the three main players, and that's how things look at the moment. But that's the official version. We don't know what's going on under the surface.
In terms of Lukashenko, I mean, it was really interesting that he was the person who brokered this. I mean, surely that a smaller, as many Russians would say it, lesser nation's president was the person who brokered this would have been something that actually weakened Putin in the first place anyway, that he had to rely on somebody else to sort of get him out of this, or is that too simplistic, Mary?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with that, because I find it very unusual and really doubt whether Putin would have accepted any sort of third-party mediation if he hadn't judged that it was absolutely essential. You know, Putin doesn't strike you as somebody who really calls on outside help in any sort of circumstances. So the fact that Lukashenko came forward to broker this deal, as it appears, is interesting. It's also interesting that if you look back right to the beginning of after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko actually put himself forward then as a mediator, or at least of Belarus as the venue for the first talks that took place very early on between officials of Ukraine and officials of Russia. They took place just inside Belarus, very close to the border with Ukraine. So you can sort of see that Lukashenko has had an eye to presenting himself as a mediator, that this wasn't just a single occasion.
I wonder if he will in some way try to leverage his stewardship, his asylum essentially for Prigozhin in some way. And I wonder about the future of Prigozhin, whether he's going to simply go off into the sunset in his new accommodation in Belarus, or whether it's a good idea to perhaps invest in a bungalow, because there are a number of people who have a bad habit of falling out of windows or having funny tasting tea when Vladimir Putin's involved.
Well, there are all sorts of theories about what might happen to Prigozhin, including the last sort of malign possible outcomes.
Yes.
I think my favourite suggestion would probably be that he would leave maybe to concentrate on the activities of his Wagner group in Africa, because it seems that they are apparently going to be still active there as mercenaries on contract for various governments, including that of Mali. So I think he might decide to do that. The idea that he would stay in Belarus sort of indefinitely is quite hard to believe. Also, all the talk is that the Wagner people will take no further part in the Ukraine war. Some of them, it appears, they were certainly encouraged to sign up for the regular Russian forces. Some of them were, others were told that they could choose to go back to their homes. Others could follow Prigozhin into exile, and it's not at all clear how many of the forces there were to start with. Anything between 25,000 and sort of 6,000, and how the decisions they've taken have broken down. So how many of them may fetch up in Belarus, how many of them may fetch up with the regular Russian forces, we simply don't know.
Just speaking about the war in Ukraine, there's a very curious development this week where we saw Greta Thunberg, the environmental activist, joining a long list of celebrities and politicians going in and out of sort of Zelensky's parlour there. I wonder what we should make of that move, or maybe there's nothing to make of that. It just seems to be we're sort of getting into an almost sort of farcical situation where we have sort of pro-Ukrainian experts in regard to really anybody, especially people like Greta Thunberg. I don't know what she's got to do with the Ukrainian war.
No, I mean, I think there's an awful lot of celebrities and campaigners on the one hand wanting a bit of Zelensky's luster to work off on them. That paying court to Zelensky and to express support for Kiev has become, the thing to do, and I wouldn't necessarily see it as more significant than that.
Yeah.
What I do think is quite interesting is that now you're looking at Greta Thunberg, Bono, various other people as going to Kiev. What you're not seeing anymore is really the top-level statesmen, senior political figures from around the world. Kiev seems to be running out of those sort of people, and Zelensky is pitching himself less. You remember, the time when he was on Zoom calls pretty much all over the world. Yeah. Those times seem to be over.
And it's interesting as well that, if Bono or Greta Thunberg are flying into Kyiv, it's clearly not that dangerous.
No, that's true too, and I think it hasn't been that dangerous for quite a long time. And the trouble with that, of course, is the uncertainty. I mean, you've looked this week. We've had the strike on the pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk, really quite close to the front line on the Ukrainian side, where there were more victims, about a dozen people killed, maybe 50 people injured. That was one of the most costly Russian missile attacks on any part of Ukraine, and it appears to be connected. A response by Putin, by the Russians, to the failed mutiny. It was one way that they decided to respond. But so much of this is unpredictable. Yeah. I mean, Kiev, it looks to be exempt from direct Russian hits in the middle of Kiev, at least, anywhere near Zelensky. The western city of Lviv also seems to be largely spared, and the railways and the roads where Western weapons are arriving into Kiev, the main routes for Western weapon supplies, they've been hardly touched at all by Russian fire. Now, what do you make of that? And could that change one day?
I just have two more questions for you, Mary. I wonder, there are a lot of pro-Ukrainian so-called experts anyway, and the thing that we like about you is you tell the truth and you're not on any side. They like to tell us that Putin is very unpopular within Russia. Do you think that's true? Because it's hard to get a sense of this, really, because the elections aren't democratic, we know that. The media is controlled. In terms of a sense of how popular he is and how much people actually like him and are happy with him as their president, how do you kind of gauge that?
It's almost impossible to gauge, and it's one of these things that could also almost flip overnight because you don't know what's operating under the surface. Some people pointed out that there were no sort of public demonstrations in Putin's support when the mutiny was happening. Now, I wouldn't have expected that because a lot of Russia is under essentially not exactly emergency conditions, but protests, demonstrations, appearing on the streets, even to support the president, and especially if maybe last Saturday you didn't necessarily know the outcome. That wasn't, it wasn't something that I saw as indicating necessarily that Putin lacked public support. I think one of the things you can say at the moment is that there is a sort of passive support for the status quo. We saw last Saturday that there were little upsurges of what looked like enthusiasm for Prigozhin and his mutineers. We saw them being cheered on the streets of Rostov, the big city in the south where the Prigozhin people took the airbase and the military control center for Ukraine operations briefly. But, there were people pointing out, well, it was a sort of curiosity. It was somebody from out of nowhere. People were taking selfies with them like celebrities. It's very hard to necessarily to project that as meaning that there was huge popular support for Prigozhin. What was interesting...
it's essentially, it's not quite, but it's essentially anecdotal as well, isn't it? We can't extrapolate from it.
Yes, but what was interesting was that in the middle of this week, one of the Kremlin and Putin's responses, apparently specifically to that episode, was that Putin went down to the city of Derbent, which is a very, very ancient city in the southern region of Dagestan. And Putin did something that he's almost not been seen doing for years, which was to go out on the streets and really to do a walkabout and have selfies taken with him. And it looked exactly like a sort of equal and opposite response to what had happened with Prigozhin in Rostov. And it was so uncharacteristic of Putin that there were people saying, well, actually, it wasn't Putin at all. It was just a body dump.
Right, yes. Yes.
But I don't think that really matters because the message is the same. The message was that Putin wanted to show himself out there as a popular figure who crowds would rally to.
Final question for you, Mary, this afternoon, although no doubt there'll be many more questions as time goes on. We love it when you join us. What about China in all of this? Where is it sort of positioning itself in regard to Putin's future?
Two very interesting things about this. There has been trundling along for about the last 2 months a ceasefire plan drafted by China, which looks quite even-handed in that it says some things that are quite harsh for Russia to take, and also sets demands for concessions by Kiev, which are completely out of the question for Kiev. But the interesting thing about that peace plan is that although it's sort of vanished from anybody's headlines, neither Kiev nor Russia nor China has actually abandoned it yet. So that, or a version of that, still seems to be in play. Another thing, though, that was very, very interesting was that after Putin had seen off the mutineers this time last week, one of the first things that appears to have happened is that he sent a special envoy to Beijing. Now, that suggests that he may have been worried about the perception in Beijing about the strength of Putin's hold on power. And I just think it's a very interesting sideline that he appears to have been worried about the impression that the events of last Saturday would have made as far away as China.
Absolutely. Mary, thank you so much, as always. Mary Dejevsky there, who is a foreign affairs columnist at The Independent. She's a former Russia correspondent for a number of publications, including The Independent and The Times as well. So thank you very much indeed to her.